ये मेरा घर है और मेरे घर में रहना है तो मेरे नियम कानून से रहना होगा। राइटर वाइटर बनने का बकवास सपना देख लियो, उसे बोरी में बंद करो और जाकर नदी में डाल के आओ। उड़ना बंद करो, पाँव को जमीन पे रखो। समझ में आ रहा है?
जी सर।
Like all great films, there's a lot to say about Udaan, but I'm most interested in what it conveys about masculinity, strength, and generational abuse. Almost every character is male, and their identities and dynamics drive the story's dramatic arc. Rohan and Bhairav's ongoing conflict reveals how men can greatly differ in their views about masculinity, even when they're biologically related or live together. But let's take a step back. What is masculinity? Masculinity is a social construct that describes the roles, behaviors, and attitudes that society expects or considers appropriate for men and boys.
He's enterprising, aggressive, young, bold, vicious. He'll do.
Notably, research suggests that, quote, masculine attributes like aggression and violence don't reflect innate but learned tendencies from parents, peers, and the media.
There is no trait at all that's only for males and no females, or only for females and no males. What there are these continua, right? And some of us fall anywhere along those paths. We're pushed to those margins as if they were natural.
As you can imagine, the definition of masculinity varies per society and changes based on what's prominent or in vogue at the time. Indian society has always been patriarchal, which is derived from the Greek word patriarchis, which means father or male chief. So patriarchy means rule of the father. Like in other patriarchal societies, India has tended to give males greater access to money, property, and positions of power in the governments, courts, and business throughout its history. That's not to say everything is easy for men. I know it's not. We're getting there. As we've alluded to in a previous video, prior to British colonization, Indian manhood was part of a larger ecosystem of gender identities and expressions, which were celebrated and even worshipped. However, during colonization, the British used a few key techniques to keep India under their control, such as by convincing Indians they were uneducated pagans who needed the British to help them become more civilized and respectable. The British also used propaganda to challenge Indian masculinity to justify the British Raj and protect their own egos, saying things like, "You Indian men are effeminate and weak. You can't protect your own country or run a government. You need us, real men, to do that for you." And Indian men were persuaded to become more English and adopt British Victorian ideas about masculinity, such as militarism, athleticism, and the subjugation of women and marginalized people. In retrospect, we call this colonial masculinity, but it contributed to traditional or hegemonic masculinity, a term popularized by Australian sociologist R.W. Connell in 1987. Connell described hegemonic masculinity as the most glorified form in patriarchal societies. It involves men asserting their dominance in all situations and oppressing, quote, inferior people. This is super important because hegemonic masculinity is designed to justify and perpetuate patriarchy, just like how the British tried to justify ruling over Indians. Hegemonic masculinity says, "I deserve to be in charge. I'm automatically the most qualified to lead because I'm a man, and I act like one." Now, you might not believe any of this, but the temptation to think this way is very real. Research shows that peer approval is extremely important to men and boys. If your male friends don't respect you or you're getting bullied, it can be devastating for a guy's mental health. And what better way to earn the respect of your male peers than to act tough and mock someone that you all consider, quote, lower or weaker, like women and queer people?
Methinks the right honourable lady doth screech too much!
How come these always have to rub it in your face?
Anything to prevent your friends from calling you a girl or gay, because those are the worst things for a guy to be called, aren't they? But boys and men who are conditioned to believe that hegemonic masculinity is aspirational are set up to be fragile. Traditional or hypermasculine boys and men are constantly afraid of being exposed as not manly enough. They feel the need to go out of their way to prove that they still belong to this mythical masculine club.
Now, who taught us that? It's other boys. It's other guys who start policing our masculinity. really early on.
Hegemonic masculinity breeds insecurity because it doesn't build sustainable confidence or self-esteem. It's designed to maintain a guy's image without addressing his inner problems. It teaches men to hide how they really feel and lie to themselves about it.
Right from childhood, they have to like certain things. They have to be passive-aggressive, active-aggressive in certain things.
For generations, Indian males have bought into the idea that this is what it takes to be an asli mard, a real man, without looking critically at the definition of traditional masculinity and noticing how it contradicts itself. A man endures pain, but he doesn't feel any pain. A man takes a woman even if she protests, but she wouldn't though, right? A man prefers to hang with the guys. No homo though.
Are you joking right now?
To fully understand Udaan's key messages, we have to delve into Bhairav's psychology, which I find fascinating. The few details we learn about his life, he says in passing or by accident. He keeps his personal information close to the vest, which is an apt summary of who he is. Bhairav is the epitome of traditional hegemonic masculinity, in that he projects confidence, dominance, and efficiency. He's focused, physically fit, hardworking, intelligent, yet miserable. He's constantly angry, lonely, and can't seem to recognize the root cause in himself. His anger drives people away, and his inability to open up to anyone prevents him from having meaningful relationships and becoming free from his negativity. It's a vicious cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy.
और रोहन, अर्जुन, हमको हमेशा अपना दुश्मन समझेंगे.
Moreover, his ideas on masculinity have shaped him into this person. The only emotion traditional masculinity approves of is anger. Therefore, Bhairav's default response to anything is anger. He's constantly on high alert for any semblance of disrespect thrown his way, and he promptly answers it with intimidation or violence.
मेरी किसी बात का तुम उल्टा जवाब नहीं दोगे. हाँ नहीं जी.
Psychologists have a name for this. It's called maladaptive aggression, which is violence committed in response to, quote, minimal or absent provocation. Maladaptive aggressive violence tends to be, quote, abrupt, impulsive, inappropriately intense, frequent, and often excessive in duration. Not to get too spiritual here, but the Bhagavad Gita sheds light on anger. Chapter 2, verse 62 and 63 say, while contemplating sense objects, one develops attachment to them. Attachment leads to desire, and from desire arises anger. Anger leads to the clouding of judgment, which results in the bewilderment of memory. When the memory is bewildered, the intellect is destroyed. And when the intellect is destroyed, one is ruined. Bhairav goes through this trajectory countless times in Udaan, and it takes so little for him to lose his temper. In that way, he's extremely weak. He's not in control of his mind or body. He's just at the mercy of his anger. God forbid something goes wrong, he'll lose his mind. And things of course go wrong, because that's how life is. And predictably, his actions have grave consequences. His 6-year-old needs to be hospitalized after Bhairav beats him with a belt. But traditional masculinity doesn't encourage feeling remorse because that would require self-reflection and admitting you made a mistake. Therefore, Bhairav resists thinking about how his explosive rage hurts others. He spits at the idea of cowardice, but he's too cowardly to face himself and his misdeeds. Which again drives people away and exacerbates his loneliness. Lastly, traditional masculinity doesn't approve of expressing one's pain or asking for help. So Bhairav represses his anguish, expecting it to disappear. Research shows that consciously suppressing and unconsciously repressing emotions like sadness or grief tends to manifest in other ways, like anxiety, depression, chronic pain, and high blood pressure, which can increase your risk of a heart attack. Other studies have found that when people don't allow themselves to express emotions like disgust or sadness, those feelings become more intense on the inside. In other words, buried emotions don't dissolve. They just fester like an open wound. When his younger brother Jimmy tries to reason with him, it triggers something in Bhairav. Demonstrating how fresh those feelings still are for him. He's a fully grown adult, but his childhood resentment toward his family is still intact because he hasn't processed it. So while he considers himself the most senior, responsible, and respectable family member, his unresolved pain has rendered him incapable of maintaining relationships with his brother, children, and probably ex-wife.
Men expressing anger is tolerated and expected, but men expressing sadness is not.
You'll see that a guy who's very expressive, or maybe somebody who cries out in a public place, if there's something that's bothered him, he's deemed feminine.
The elephant in the room, if you will, about so much of men's emotional expressiveness is homophobia. That fear that, somehow expressing yourself, vulnerability, all of those ideas that we associate actually with gay men.
I actually don't think it has anything to do with gay sex. I think it's like, I can't be emotional as a male.
Yeah.
I can't tell my good friend who I would jump in front of a bullet for that I love him.
In that kind of a performance throughout life, what they miss out is they try very hard to contain their vulnerabilities and emotional lows, right? And it is very difficult for them to share a kind of warm bond with, let's say, other men.
Rohan doesn't explicitly state his definition of masculinity at any point, but we get a sense of his perspective from how he carries himself and interacts with other males. He's contemplative and channels that energy into his writing. His poems and stories are intelligent, thought-provoking, and beautiful. He's a little reserved, but is undoubtedly warm, loving, and kind. His Uncle Jimmy and friends from boarding school and college are similarly supportive, creating a safe space for him and others to share honest, vulnerable emotions. These relationships offer respite and safety because they allow Rohan to be himself and talk about the stress and pressure he feels without judgment. Even when he's in the midst of doing his father's grueling routine, Rohan feels somewhat content because he has multiple outlets for processing his negative emotions, such as talking to people who love him, writing in his notebook, and taking walks. These activities are all forms of the same practice. Witnessing. By witnessing his negative thoughts and emotions, he's able to become free from them. The race between Bhairav and Rohan is a recurring sequence that sets up the difficult dynamic between them, builds pressure within Rohan, and closes out the film. I think it's a metaphor for strength. Every day, Rohan comes up short, suggesting that his father is stronger.
Disgraceful.
But on the last day, when Rohan is actually running for his life, he wins. But how? I don't think it's because Rohan suddenly became more physically fit than Bhairav overnight, but rather it's because Rohan has cultivated a strength that Bhairav doesn't have. Emotional resilience, which is the ability to cope with stressful or unexpected situations and mentally recover. While Bhairav can't handle even the smallest inconvenience, Rohan can handle intense challenges and opposition and still maintain his equilibrium. While Bhairav gets extremely rattled when something reflects poorly on him, Rohan perseveres through many situations where things are unfamiliar, and he's made to look inferior. There are several reasons why. 1. Rohan has a fuller sense of self than Bhairav does. No one thing defines him. He enjoys the quiet of nature, reciting his poems and stories with animation and acting, and hanging out with his friends at the boisterous bar and cinema. 2. His friends, uncle, and brother encourage him in his art, which gives him an outlet to express his emotions and process what's happening to him. It might seem counterintuitive that emotional vulnerability builds strength, but it's true. The practice of witnessing creates space between you and your negative emotions until they don't control you anymore. You're able to move on. In the Vijnana Bhairav, Lord Shiva says, observing the desires which spring up in a flash puts an end to them. Then, verily, the mind will be absorbed in the very source from which they have arisen. When lust, anger, greed, delusion, arrogance, and jealousy are seen within, having fixed the mind completely on these, the underlying tattva, or essence, alone remains. In other words, the inner self is the ultimate witness. So by witnessing your thoughts and emotions with increasing detachment, you're practicing identifying with the inner self rather than the body or mind. This is powerful stuff. 3. In the final race, Bhairav is running to punish Rohan, a near-term fixation, but Rohan is running to live and free himself from his father's oppression, which is a stronger long-term goal. 4. Rohan's friends and relatives have taught him that he's inherently worthy of love and kindness. In return, Rohan's love has become a force that propels and inspires him to live for himself and them, which is somewhat selfless in that it's part of a broader mission. With all of this in mind, it makes a lot of sense that Rohan wins. I think it's meant to be a proof point that Rohan is stronger than his father, and Rohan's version of masculinity is perfectly valid. In the Tao Te Ching, Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu says, "Men are born soft and supple. Dead, they are stiff and hard. Plants are born tender and pliant. Dead, they are brittle and dry. Thus, whoever is stiff and inflexible is a disciple of death. Whoever is soft and yielding is a disciple of life. The hard and stiff will be broken. The soft and supple will prevail. Those who try to control, who use force to protect their power, go against the direction of the Tao. The Tao is the way of the universe, the highest path to freedom and peace." Udaan provides additional commentary on the contrast between Bhairav and Rohan through its use of light. The interior light of Bhairav's apartment is cold and blue, similar to his factory, which could represent his cruel, loveless nature. Interestingly, we get glimpses of warm, orange light outside, but even when the door is wide open, the light doesn't cross the threshold of the apartment, which might allude to the thick, oppressive environment that Bhairav has created within. Also, notably, in Bhairav's apartment, the curtains are always closed. Bhairav's face is often shrouded in darkness, even when the room is partially lit. The darkness could represent his ignorance, symbolizing that he's oblivious to his own suffering and those of others around him. The perpetual darkness in his apartment and factory suggests that he chooses to live like that because he likes and is used to it. He's trained his eyes to see in the dark and is therefore willfully ignorant. Bhairav's preference for darkness might also symbolize how he doesn't have much to live or hope for. His obsession with hegemonic masculinity has taken everything from him. He also wears sunglasses when he picks up Rohan from the train station and during the family picnic, suggesting that in those intimate moments, he wants to hide his eyes, the windows to his emotions. Maybe he also wants to block the warm sunlight, which could represent tenderness and love. It can't be that sunny, no one else is wearing sunglasses. In contrast, Rohan and Harjant are often surrounded by warm light, particularly as they become closer. They embrace it, symbolizing that they aren't afraid to show love and affection, even though they're both male.
Indian parents aren't afraid to kill their kids if they have to, you know? My dad's theory was, if I get rid of one, I'll just make another one. And I will tell the new one what an idiot the last one was.
Adverse childhood experiences or ACEs like child abuse can have lifelong consequences on a person's physical and mental health. For example, child and domestic abuse typically cause emotional dysregulation in children and foster wrong ideas about relationships. In a 2022 study with over 5,500 participants from across the subcontinent, Indian men who were physically abused as children or saw their fathers beating their mothers were more likely to beat their wives and believe it's justified. Unfortunately, child abuse is extremely common in India. According to a 2018 study from UNICEF, there are at least 30 forms of physical, verbal, and emotional abuse inflicted on Indian children at home. I think we all joke about our experiences with abuse because it helps us cope with the fact that abuse is baked into our culture. Indian families are hierarchical, and older people will sometimes use abusive techniques to maintain their superiority and ensure that children obey them. Researchers have tried to determine if and how child abuse is transmitted from generation to generation, and the results aren't that straightforward. Studies suggest that adults who experience a particular type of abuse as children aren't likely to inflict that same type of abuse on their children, but rather other forms of maltreatment, neglect, or bad parenting. However, some adults who were abused as children consciously don't abuse their children because they want to break the cycle, which is awesome. Overall, though, adults who were abused or neglected as children tend to have trouble maintaining healthy relationships. They typically have insecure attachment styles and poor ways of dealing with negative emotions. As a result, they don't tend to have the sensibility or emotional capacity to give a child what they need.
और ऐसा नहीं है कि तुम्हारे स्कूल नहीं आया, आए थे, तुम्हारे प्रिंसिपल से भी मिले, तुमको देखा तो मैदान में फुटबॉल खेल रहे थे, खुश लग रहे थे, इसलिए तुमसे बात नहीं की। वैसे भी तुमको कहने के लिए हमारे पास कोई अच्छी बात थी भी नहीं।
Bhairav is a victim of child abuse and maltreatment, which I believe contributed to his maladaptive aggression. I'm not making excuses for him, but I want us to have this context. I think his behavior is so extreme because it represents 2 generations of abuse, from his grandfather to his father, and his father to him.
ये घड़ी हमारे दादाजी की थी। उन्होंने बाबूजी को दी और बाबूजी ने हमको।
We never see Bhairav's forefathers even in photographs, but their presence is palpable. Accordingly, a third lesson that Udaan imparts is that breaking the cycle of generational abuse requires self-reflection and intentionality, 2 things that Bhairav doesn't have. Clinicians unanimously say that the first step to breaking the cycle of generational abuse is recognizing abuse. Bhairav's abuse from his father has taught him to endure pain and bottle it up, which we know is bad for us. And as we've mentioned, he's resistant to any form of introspection as an adult. He doesn't acknowledge what he went through as abuse. Therefore, he doesn't perceive what he's doing as abuse. In Bhairav's mind, it's normal for a father to use violence and threats to raise a son and transform him into a man. His refusal to think deeply about his trauma prevents him from realizing that hitting and threatening one's children is completely inappropriate. Rohan, on the other hand, is naturally inclined to self-reflect because he has a strong support system and is a writer. Rohan also spent 8 years away from Bhairav while at boarding school. Therefore, he's better able to see his father's behavior objectively and recognize that it's abnormal. Rohan adjusts his speech and posture around Bhairav to avoid being attacked, suggesting he's aware that his father doesn't offer a safe space for Rohan to be honest or himself. When Arjun gets hurt, Rohan develops even greater perspective on his father's abuse. He sees that by being complicit in this toxic home environment, he and this child will suffer. Therefore, when Bhairav escalates his tyranny, something snaps in Rohan that confirms that he and Bhairav will always be at odds, and it would be better for both of them if Rohan left. After speaking with his uncle, Rohan makes the conscious decision to not only reject his family's legacy of abuse, symbolized by returning the watch, but also end the generational cycle of abuse by taking Arjun with him, away from Bhairav's influence permanently. Bhairav's traditional masculinity made him a slave to his family's legacy. He wrongfully conflated the delivery and tolerance of abuse with manliness and didn't reflect on how the abuse made him feel. In contrast, Rohan's continuous introspection allowed him to recognize that his father's behavior is wrong, won't ever change, and his father doesn't need him.
और आपकी रीढ़ में कौन सी हड्डी है? आपने भी तो हमसे झूठ बोला कि अर्जुन सीढ़ियों से गिर गया था, जबकि वो सीढ़ियों से नहीं गिरा था. हम जानते हैं कि आपने उसे बेल्ट से मारा था.
उसकी वजह से मेरा लाखों का कॉन्ट्रैक्ट गया. उसे पता होना चाहिए कि इतने बड़े नुकसान की भरपाई कैसे होती है.
मार खा के.
गलती से हो गया.
उसे हॉस्पिटल भेज के.
हम बोले ना हम उसको हॉस्पिटल नहीं भेजना चाहते थे. हम बोले ना कि गलती हो गई. हम नहीं मारना चाहते थे उसे और माफी भी मांगी उससे हम.
वाह सर, जिंदगी भर के लिए घाव दे दो पीठ पर, डरा दो बच्चे को और फिर माफी मांग लो.
In doing so, Rohan took concrete steps to protect his future family from harboring maladaptive ideas about masculinity, strength, and relationships. Good on him. Clearly, Udaan teaches us a lot, but I'd like to recap a few things. 1. Traditional or hegemonic masculinity is designed to keep men in charge, but at the expense of their humanity. 2. It ironically makes them weaker and more cowardly. 3. It doesn't understand the value of inner strength and resilience, which are essential for dealing with the inevitable ups and downs of life. But you know better.
When I was a kid, I thought that men have to be angry. And because of that, I had a really weird relationship with friends and family.
The society in general needs to accept that you need to let men have display their emotions in a place which is safe for them.
Practice witnessing your negative thoughts and emotions. It will go a long way. That being said, it takes a lot of courage to look within yourself and witness what feels imperfect. Not everyone has the strength to do this, but I have faith in you.
नशा आसमान का जो चूमता तुम्हें, हसरतें तुम्हारी नया जन्म पाती, खुद दूसरे जन्म में मेरी उड़ान छूने, कुछ दूर तुम भी साथ साथ आते.
Good luck. Bye.